Thank you so much for joining us for this COVID-19 vaccine and transplant discussion hosted by the Center for Living Organ Donation at the Ajmeri Transplant Center at UHN. This center cares for the largest number of transplant recipients in Canada, and it's wonderful to see so many patients and community members joining us today. My name is Joanne Carney, and I sit on the Toronto General and Western Hospital Foundation Board of Directors, but I'm also a patient at UHN, having received a kidney transplant 4 years ago, where my husband, Brendan, donated his kidneys to me through the Living Kidney Paired Exchange program. This pandemic has been an anxious time for all of us, so I think I can speak for everyone to say that the opportunity to ask transplant experts these questions is very much appreciated. But before jumping in and starting with those questions, I'd like to thank the Toronto General and Western Hospital Foundation and Astellas Pharma for both making this event possible and for their continued and longtime support of the Ajmeri Transplant Center, and in particular, living organ donation. Knowledge truly lives here every day at UHN, and through the many groundbreaking achievements, we see what their knowledge can do. So today, we have this opportunity to tap into that incredible knowledge. We received over 200 questions, probably even more since I last checked, and it's really incredible that people are so engaged and of course have so many questions. And while we can't answer each one of these today, we can really see three clear overarching themes. The first is the vaccine safe for transplant recipients? The second is, when it comes to these vaccines, what do transplant recipients need to be most mindful of? And the third theme, what does the community around us, our family members, living organ donors, those waiting for a transplant, what do they need to be most mindful of when it comes to the vaccine? So our aim is to cover these three themes today, and everything else we'll tackle at our upcoming sessions in March and April. Because there's so many things we can talk about, we wanted to sort of divide them up into 3 sessions. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Kumar, an infectious disease physician at the Ajmeri Transplant Center, who will be leading our discussion. Dr. Kumar is on the front lines of the vaccine conversation here in Ontario, and she is a true advocate for our transplant community at that table. Dr. Kumar, to kick us off, will you shed some light on these discussions in the current vaccine landscapes here in Ontario and across the country?
Sure. Thank you, Joanne. It's really a pleasure to be here and to be able to communicate with all of you who are on the call and answer your questions. I'll start off by saying that COVID has really impacted all of us, including the way that we deliver healthcare. But I'm optimistic and very hopeful that with the vaccine rollout, we're seeing a light at the end of a very long tunnel. So we have received a lot of questions about where transplant patients fall on the priority list for the COVID vaccine. Now, we don't have all the answers right now, but I will say that that phase 1 is based on, as you know, on vaccinating healthcare workers and those in long-term care facilities. Some transplant recipients have actually already been vaccinated as part of phase 1 because they fall into those categories. Phase 2 of the Ministry of Health plan includes those with chronic conditions. This is where we believe that transplant recipients, most transplant recipients will be included. Now, people with chronic conditions is a very big group. So I want to assure you that we are definitely at the table and advocating for you as transplant recipients to be as close as possible to the top of that phase 2 group as much as possible. The other big question that we've gotten is about vaccine logistics. How will you know when it's your turn, and where will you need to go to get the vaccine? I will say that our program will communicate with you as soon as we hear about any of this. Right now, as you know, vaccines are being given at dedicated vaccine centers. We are trying to work out ways that vaccines could be given in other places, like at doctors' offices or even in the transplant clinic. It all depends on the storage conditions of these vaccines. As you know, these vaccines they have to be stored in ultra cold storage. So a lot of the logistics have to be worked out if the vaccines are going to be given anywhere outside a vaccine center. So, and then the other thing I'll mention is that we are doing research with the COVID vaccine to see how well it will protect transplant recipients against COVID. And if you're interested in participating, we'll be talking more about this at the end of the program. So I'll turn it back to you, Joanne.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Kumar. And personally, thank you for being our advocate at that table and for sort of championing our unique needs. It's so wonderful to know that there's someone there, someone active, and we look forward to learning what may be to come soon. I'll now like to bring in our other panelists who each represent a different organ group. We're going to ask them to provide an overview of the current COVID situation and the impact they're seeing in their day-to-day practices. So let's start with Dr. Mushi.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for having me on this panel. And I hope that everybody's having a quiet, not very chaotic afternoon with the snowfall and the traffic issues. And that's certainly one advantage. We need to find advantages in this situation. So we don't need to travel, so we don't need to sit in traffic jams. That's one good thing about this. Now, so what happened to transplant, to kidney transplant specifically, as probably we'll come back to that later on, early on in the first wave, kidney transplantation slowed down. In fact, for a few weeks, there was no kidney transplantation at the Toronto General Hospital at all. And subsequently, kidney transplant resumed. Both deceased and living donor kidney transplant has been happening. And certainly, one additional good side about the avoiding traffic jam is that we haven't seen many patients who caught the COVID after transplant. So obviously, we will discuss that as well, that patients who take these anti-rejection medications, patients who are transplant recipients, they may be at a higher risk to catch the virus and also to have a somewhat more severe course of the illness. And this may be more so soon after transplant. And certainly in the kidney transplant recipient population, we haven't seen that many cases soon after transplant. In the spring, overall, I would say, and Dr. Kumar will probably be adding more numbers or more facts, that in the spring, we haven't seen too many cases overall in the transplant patients. In the fall, the second and third wave, if we can categorize that, it seems that there are many more transplant recipients, many more kidney transplant recipients specifically, who got the virus. And a significant proportion of those patients had to be hospitalized, and some had quite severe course overall. It seems, though, that the numbers in Toronto, at least as it comes to the kidney transplant recipient group, was somewhat milder, perhaps, than what some of the reports from international centers published. And I'll give it back to you, and we'll be happy to comment on this later.
Thanks very much, Dr. Mushi. Over to you, Dr. Selzner.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. So I am Nazia Selzner. I am one of the transplant hepatologists at the Ajmera Transplant Center. I do see patients who need a transplant, a liver transplant. I do follow patients who are on the waiting list for transplant and after transplantation. And I also do see many live donors who come forward to be a donor, and as they go on to have their donation completed. So involved in various aspects of the program. In terms of the liver transplantation, I must say that because there is no substitute for liver transplant, really, there is no dialysis machine. The program has always been on and running despite COVID. Both in terms of cadaveric as well as living-related liver transplantation. And we did end up the year doing a number of cadaveric organs, as well as a good portion of living donation despite COVID. Similar to what you heard from Dr. Mushi in terms of the impact on liver transplant recipient, we do see a number of recipients, or we get called by the number of recipients that have been tested positive And I must say, very few of them required actually admission to hospital, or for what matters, admission to ICU and required intubation. And majority of them are actually managed as outpatient, and they were tested positive either because they have mild symptoms or some of their family members were tested positive, etc. So this is the update basically from the liver transplant. And I have to also emphasize that it is really important that with any type of symptoms, liver transplant recipient, or for what matters, any type of recipient or solid organ recipient, should go and get tested so that we are aware and we are able to adjust their immunosuppression based on positive test.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Salzner. Now let's go to Dr. Chaparro.
Thank you very much, Joanne, for the invitation. So it's great to join all my colleagues here and be able to tell you where we are in our program with the COVID. So first of all, similar to my colleagues, I see patients pre-transplant, I see patients post-transplant, and I'm happy to say that initially with the first wave, we didn't really have many patients, but the very few ones that we had with COVID, they really unfortunately didn't do very well because of the previous condition of chronic rejection already. In the second wave, we have seen more patients coming to the hospital requiring admission. And definitely, I have to say that in the lungs group, because the lungs being exposed, I think that is just a matter of being kind of opened to get not only virus, but any other infection. So we have seen more patients really, despite the measures taken coming to the hospital. So I think that from our team, we are very strong advising our patients to really follow the health guidelines, avoid gatherings, avoid really exposure in any sense, keep isolated. And if they have any symptoms, of course, immediately contact us. And of course, we recommend them once the vaccine is available to really go and get it. And on our side, what we have been trying to also do to help them is to avoid bringing them to the hospital if it's not needed. So we are trying to really minimize the time that they come to the hospital to be exposed. We did have the program closed for a few weeks in the early first wave. I guess it was also a matter of precaution because we didn't want to get donors that maybe were infected. We are now quite open, and I think that having the capacity to do testing for the donors before we transplant them, it makes things easier. We do know there are patients who are in absolute need of lungs, if no, the option is really nothing. So I think that we really are not planning to close the program, and we hope that we'll continue being really successful with our patients and try to avoid infection as much as possible until we have the vaccine and we are able to really see each other again.
Thanks, Dr. Chaparro. A very clear message there. Continue to follow all health protocols, which is we can't reiterate that enough. Now let's move on to Andrea Norgate.
Hi, thanks. I'm Andrea Norgate. I'm the kidney, pancreas, and islet cell transplant coordinator. We initially closed the program very briefly, actually, just for about 5 weeks or so in the first wave. And I'd say within the program, we've got about 5% of positivity of COVID, which really sort of ranges between asymptomatic people that are at home and managed quite well there, and people that did require hospitalization. My message to any of our patients would be to, if you start to show symptoms or if you come in contact with someone who has COVID, that to get tested immediately so that any kind of early intervention that we can possibly provide as an outpatient can be started. And I think that actually gives the best result. Thankfully, everyone is back home. Most of the transmissions that we had could be traced back to family members who were essential workers that did bring it home to our patients, unfortunately. And we've just sort of been lucky to be able to trace it back to that, and so the rest of the family could be tested too. But early intervention and early testing and prompt testing and letting us know would be the message that we had. And of course, like the lungs, we'd say as soon as the vaccine is available to you, run, go and get it.
Sure, we'll all be running very fast. And now, thank you. And last but not least, let's hear from the heart perspective with Dr. McDonald.
Thank you very much for the invitation to participate, and hopefully you're detecting a few similar themes across the different organ groups. And one of the things that occurs to me is that we have more similarities than differences, irrespective of what kind of transplant recipient or transplant patient you are or may be. We see transplant patients before and after their transplant, patients with advanced heart failure. And the biggest challenge for us has been the pivot to virtual care. Of our 3,000 to 4,000 visits a year, we do about 90 to 95% of those virtually now, which has some advantages, but many disadvantages. And we're learning very much, as the rest of the world is, as we go. During the first wave, we shut down activity, except for patients who were in critical need of heart transplant, and only did the high urgent or emergency cases. And our activity really dwindled for a couple of months there in the spring of last year during wave 1. Fortunately, we were able to make up ground and had a really fast rate of transplantation for the rest of the year, and actually maintained our usual numbers and volumes, which was a testament to the efforts of a big team, and to the fact that we were a little bit lucky that we were able to keep our patients pretty well and healthy throughout. During the second wave, we've had a small number of COVID cases, just as you heard from Andrea. A lot of it was from family member spread and unavoidable situations or high-risk contacts. Fortunately, the majority of our patients have done well despite COVID infection, and I think our outcomes in our transplanted heart transplant patients reflect those of the general population so far. And again, one of the things that's been nice to see is just the clear messaging from our program to our patients, such that I think our patients have fully embraced public health measures and are doing everything they can to reasonably protect themselves and their families. And so I think that's gone a long way to keeping transmission at bay. And I'm sure as you'll hear with the discussion that follows, we're going to be looking for the earliest opportunity to get all of our heart transplant patients vaccinated as soon as possible.
Great. Thank you, Dr. McDonald. And thank you to each of you. Hearing this sort of insight and these perspectives into each program is, I find very helpful, because you can't read about that in the news, and it helps to reinforce what we need to continue to do as we are in this this journey towards vaccines. So with that, and with each of you, some of the brightest minds at UHN's Transplant Center, let's jump right in and pick your brains more about, let's start first with safety and the COVID vaccine. So I'll start with you, Dr. Kumar. We've seen a very fast, efficient, and streamlined development of the vaccine, which is incredible and groundbreaking science. But at the same time, it has led to a lot of questions and perhaps some skepticism around, is it safe? Is there been enough research? Can you sort of shed some light onto that, on the process and whether or not it is safe?
So thanks, Joanne, for that question. That's a really important question, because, one of the things, as you mentioned, we've seen in this pandemic is that the COVID vaccine has been developed in record time. It's been developed at a very high pace. But I will say that no corners have been cut in developing this vaccine. The reason that we've seen such rapid development is because a lot of resources and a lot of funding has gone into the development of this vaccine. I mean, every single person who knows anything about vaccination has been working on a COVID vaccine. So the rapid pace is not concerning. In fact, it's an excellent thing that has happened. In terms of the safety of the vaccines, the vaccines have been trialed in clinical trials, have enrolled thousands of patients. So even with the first two, the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, it's over 70,000 people have been enrolled in these studies before the vaccines were licensed. And I can tell you that that number is way over what we would see in a normal vaccine study. So in a normal vaccine study, we might see 16 or 20,000 people being enrolled. This is definitely more than what we have seen. So because of that, we have more safety information. And I can tell you that these vaccines are safe. They've been reviewed by in Canada by Health Canada and in the United States by the FDA. And everybody has looked in detail at all the side effects and have deemed them to be safe. The side effects of these vaccines are similar to other vaccines, like the flu shot. The side effects are very similar, and I think we have nothing really to worry about in terms of getting these vaccines.
The size and scale of those studies is very, very reassuring and good to hear. Can you shed some light on how, what's the safety for transplant recipients specifically?
So, these vaccines have not been trialed in transplant recipients. So when the first phase 3 trials were done, they did not include anyone who was on immune suppressing medications or anyone who had an immune suppressing condition. So in that sense, we actually don't have information on the safety of these vaccines, in particular in transplant recipients. However, one thing I'll say is that we have been using vaccines in general in the transplant population for a long time without actually having specific information. So, we offer pneumonia vaccine, we offer flu shots without really any specific transplant related information. And all those vaccines have been safe. So there's no reason to believe that the COVID vaccine would be any less safe in a transplant population than in the general population. We are getting data now from United States that where they are vaccinating their transplant recipients. There's small numbers, but we are getting data that people have received their first and second doses. Transplant recipients have gotten first and second doses of the Pfizer or Moderna vaccines, and there have not been any unexpected side effects. So I think that's actually very reassuring. And I think in the next few weeks, we're going to see more information from our neighbors to the south and also from Europe that's coming out.
And perhaps that's a silver lining in our vaccine rollout stage, that we can look at our friends around us and see the research there. And how about the safety for transplant candidates or people on the wait list? Is this vaccine safe for them?
Right. So again, there's no reason to believe the vaccine would have any different side effects in people, in people who are waiting for transplants. One thing that I will mention, if you are waiting for transplant, is that if your turn comes, you should really go ahead and get the vaccine. Because I have been hearing that, should I wait for my transplant? Should I get the vaccine after having the transplant? So I will just say to that if your turn comes, go ahead and get the vaccine. Definitely don't wait.
Okay. Get the vaccine. It's a big message. Dr. Mushi, I'd like to bring you in and ask a question. You are very known and very passionate about your work in equity in the healthcare system. What's being done to address vaccine hesitancy in racialized communities in Canada where trust for the medical system has appeared to be an issue?
Yes, thank you for that question. And it is quite interesting because we are in this together, and I think we can only get out of this together. And if there is a concerted effort to provide the opportunity for vaccination for everybody. And I think overall, what has been the message for other areas of health equity, that this cannot be done without close collaboration with the communities affected. And certainly COVID has hit certain racialized communities, the African, Caribbean, and Black communities especially, but South Asian communities as well. The case number, the infection rates, and the severity has been significantly more than in the general population or in white patients. And there may be some hesitancies related to the circumstances in these communities. Communications will have to be very clear. Communications will have to be co-developed together with the communities and delivered by community members. There have been pilot studies and research both in Ontario and in other provinces led by community organizations and also researchers from these communities looking at hesitancy and creating messages and delivering those messages by community members to the community. So to make it more credible and more safe and acceptable. But the message is, and I think there might be multiple languages that we say this message, but the messages are both to follow the public guidance as it has been emphasized repeatedly, and also when the vaccine comes, the vaccine is safe for everybody, and it will protect everybody who will get. If you can't get if you don't get the vaccine, you cannot expect any protection. You need to try, and I guess again we may come back to this, but certain patient groups, both patients after transplant but also before transplant, specifically in the kidney area, patients who are on dialysis, they may not, the vaccine may not be quite as effective in those patients compared to healthy patients, but still it will be much, much better than not having the vaccine at all.
So there's obviously a clear need to engage our communities on these conversations and education. I know, Dr. Musha, you're very active in doing that. So thank you for those efforts. Before we move on to our second theme, do any of our other panelists want to jump in and add anything around the safety question when it comes to vaccines and transplant? Okay, so let's move to the second theme, which is as transplant recipients, what do we need to know and be mindful of as we kind of go through the next few months and head towards the vaccine? Dr. Kumar, let's start with you. Is there a difference between the vaccines available? When we're eligible, which vaccine should transplant recipients take, or and does the same type of theory apply whether you're a transplant recipient, candidate, or living donor?
Mm-hmm. So we have right now in Canada two authorized vaccines. So the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine. And it's possible that very soon we may have a third vaccine authorized as well. Now, you'll hear in the news and in the medical literature that, for example, the Pfizer vaccine is 95% effective and the Moderna vaccine is 94% effective, and other vaccines may be, 70 or 80% effective, and so on. We actually don't have any information on how effective they're going to be, if you've had a transplant. So at this point, what I would say is that you can get whatever vaccine you are offered, whichever vaccine is available to you. Will we have a choice of which vaccine we want to receive? Probably not, because it will probably be the vaccine that is closest to us. So it's possible that one vaccine center may carry the Pfizer vaccine, the other vaccine center may have Moderna, and you just go to the one that's closest to you. So I think at this point, the message is to basically get whichever vaccine is available to you. Now, is the same thing apply for whether you're pre-transplant or you've already had a transplant or you're a donor? So yes, the same message applies across the board. You should just get the vaccine that is first available to you.
And do the immunosuppressions that transplant recipients take, do they play a role, or do they have an impact on the vaccine, or could the vaccine interact with the immunosuppression and cause rejection?
So there's no reason to believe that the vaccine will interact with the immune suppression, and or that the vaccine will cause rejection. You know, we, again, as I mentioned before, we've used vaccines like, let's say, the flu shot for years and years. Transplant recipients have been getting flu shots every year. You know, some of you get it, you really get it every year. And we have not seen any rejection or any interaction with the immune suppressing medication. Now, the immune suppressing medication could lower the effectiveness of the vaccine. And I think that's something that we will see as time goes on. You know, one thing we've found is that even if immune suppression lowers the antibodies to the vaccine is still protective against severe disease. So I'll take an example of the flu, for example. You know, many people will say, well, I got the flu vaccine, but then I still got the flu. But what I say to that is that you got the flu, but you did not end up in the ICU. You did not end up on a ventilator. And it's possible that it'll be the same for COVID vaccine. You may get a very mild case of COVID, but you won't end up in the ICU and you won't end up on a ventilator. So even if the COVID vaccine doesn't work 100% while you're on immune suppression, it should protect you against the complications, the bad disease.
Okay, well, that's good news, and good to know that it will be studied as well. So reassuring for transplant recipients that the team is watching the impact of immunosuppression, and that it looks quite promising and similar to the flu shot. I'm going to bring in Dr. Chaparro here. We all know COVID is a respiratory disease, which reaches into your respiratory tract, including your lungs. So is there anything specific that lung transplant recipients or candidates need to know in terms of the vaccine?
Well, I don't think that will be different from other organs. I think that the recommendation will be the same. Really get your vaccine as soon as the opportunity comes. I would just remind the lung transplant patients that they will be immunosuppressed, but I must say we do use a little bit of a higher immunosuppression level comparing with other organs. So in other words, you will be more vulnerable to have the infection. And again, as I was saying before, we breathe, and everything we breathe pretty much can come to the lungs. So the virus, of course, would go to the lungs. So we do need to really be aware that we are at a higher risk comparing with other organs that are kind of hidden in the body. And the other reality is that the lungs, once they are transplanted, they are not the perfect lungs that we are born with, because there are certain defense mechanisms that don't work as well as if they were normal lungs. So definitely that will increase the risk of retaining those viruses in your lungs, and of course will lead to more complications. And what we want to avoid is getting there, because even if you get the COVID, it could be, and hopefully that you won't get very sick. But if you get sick, there will be some damage that could be permanent to the lungs. So again, the recommendation is the vaccine, and in the meantime, continue just protecting yourself and follow the guidelines. I think that we won't be tired of just making a strong recommendation about that.
Okay, thank you. And on a similar vein, Dr. McDonald, some research has indicated that COVID can cause lasting heart damage. How common is this, and what is your vaccine recommendation when it comes to heart transplant recipients and those on the waiting list?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question, and it's found its way into the popular press, and we're still very much learning about it. So when you look at patients who've recovered from COVID, there are a significant percent that have some indicators of injury to the heart. Usually that's very mild, but it still tells a story that COVID can directly affect the heart, usually by causing some inflammation. And of course, when people are critically sick in the hospital with bad COVID infection, the effects on the heart can be very pronounced and can lead to bad outcomes and having to go to the ICU in as much as the lungs can be involved. There's no reason to think that our heart transplant patients or any transplant patient is more susceptible to this than the average population, but it certainly raises your antenna and index of concern a little bit, particularly for our heart transplant patients. So when we see that and dealing with some of the uncertainties as we go along, it tips the scales when we're weighing the benefits of vaccine, which seem to be up here, recognizing the unknowns that Dr. Kumar highlighted with the potential consequences of a bad COVID infection. It's almost a certainty in my mind that that patients would do far better with the vaccine than to take a chance with a COVID exposure for if you have a history of transplant, particularly heart transplant.
I really like that clarity. Like, obviously we're still on a learning journey, but it seems pretty, the consensus is the vaccine is going to be better than COVID. So I think that's a very nice key message we can all take away from there. Before we move on to our third theme, does anybody else from the panel want to weigh in on, what recipients need to know specific to any of the organ groups? Okay, I think it sounds like we've covered that off. So let's head over to the third theme here, and that's really looking at the community around transplant. And that's family members, as I said. It could be living donors. It could be those waiting on the transplant list, those on dialysis. What do they need to be mindful of? So I'll kick it back off to Dr. Kumar and ask, how long does it take before the vaccine is effective in the body? And can one still transmit COVID or get COVID if they've been vaccinated? And then what impact does that have on living with your family members who may or may not have been vaccinated the same rate as you have?
Right. So thanks for that question, Joanne. So the vaccines that we have now are 2-dose vaccines, and they are given either 3 weeks apart or 4 weeks apart. And so to be fully protected, you need both doses, and the full force of protection of the vaccine comes about 2 weeks after the second dose. So from the time you start to the time you're actually protected is actually several weeks. It can be 5 or 6 weeks. So I think that's important to remember. The other thing that's important is that, and I think others have said this already, is to continue, even after you're vaccinated, to continue to follow precautions like distancing, like masking, like hand washing, because at this point, although we know that the vaccine prevents, severe COVID and it prevents people from getting COVID, we don't know if it prevents people from becoming carriers of COVID, asymptomatic carriers and passing it on to others. So I think until that is known, and that's being worked on, until that is known, I think we should all continue to follow precautions. And then in terms of, family members and so on, we don't really know where they will fall into the priority. Of course, we all hope that, if transplant patients are prioritized, their families are also prioritized, because it's really the whole family circle that needs to be protected. But I think that we'll find out in the coming weeks. So I think that's, we don't really know, I guess, at this point, Joanne.
Okay, well, that's a bit of stay tuned, but hopefully by our March or April sessions, we'll be able to share a bit more information about that. Dr. Selzner, can we shed some light a bit about being a living donor in COVID? Has living donation changed during COVID? Is there advantages for the living donor to be vaccinated before they donate a liver or a kidney? Like, should they wait for the vaccine or should things keep going? So if you can just shed some light on the living donation side of this, that'd be great. That'd be great.
Yes. Joanne, thank you. That's a very good question, and the question we got often. I would say if a living donor has the capacity or the access to vaccine for any particular reason, they can get the vaccine. Obviously, the recommendation is to go ahead and get the vaccine. And being vaccinated around the time of the donation surgery is not a contraindication. We have to keep in mind that the living donors are by definition healthy people. They are not immune compromised, and and they can safely receive vaccine and build immunity against COVID. As far as waiting for vaccine to become available and then proceed with living donation, because we don't know when the vaccine would be available for young healthy people who are typically the phenotype of the living donor, we won't recommend to wait. We have been carrying on with living donation in Toronto. We make all the precaution around the donor and the recipient. At the time of surgery, they receive swabs. They are tested just before the surgery, and we make sure that they remain safe and isolated in hospital. And as such, we have been able to proceed with living donation surgery and workup and assessment of the donors, and we will carry on.
Great, thank you, Dr. Selzner. And Andrea, I actually, I understand you're a living organ donor, which is absolutely wonderful. Before I ask you questions about some of your patients, do you want to shed some light about being a living organ donor and in the time of COVID and your views on navigating COVID and the vaccine?
Thanks for asking. Yeah, I donated my kidney about 5 years ago. Honestly, with COVID, I've never given it a second thought, as I've, I think a lot of people who donate their organ don't really think about it too much. It's just something that happened, and then you're like, all right, well, there we go. So I haven't, until I was sort of framed that question to me, do I worry more as a living donor? I've never even thought of it, but thanks for reminding me.
Well, my husband is exactly like you.
I think it's everybody. It's just like, oh yeah, I had chickenpox when I was 10. You don't really think about it again. You just, but as far as that's concerned, I think like every sort of person that is either a living donor or lives with someone with a chronic disease or is sort of health conscious, you are sort of like more cognizant of washing your hands, of being a little bit more careful, much like all my transplant patients or transplant patients in general. You just don't tend to go out of your way to take risks. So I think it's just sort of an appreciation for health and what you've been given and what you can give in future. So I think it's just sort of, we're just really bunch of smart people, the living donors and the recipients.
You absolutely are. You work with a lot of patients who are on dialysis or who are what's called as highly sensitized patients. Do you want to add anything specific to that patient group and getting the vaccination?
Well, having kidney disease is, you're almost at an advantage because you have dialysis. And dialysis centers have taken great steps to keep to keep people, even with COVID, to keep up with their dialysis sessions, and they screen everyone there, and everyone is masked, and sort of people who are sick or even sort of asymptomatic of COVID, they are swabbed and they are actually kept separate from the other dialysis patients, because it's not something that you can miss. If the COVID vaccine comes available, absolutely, you should get it. Take it, like if you're on the list, you shouldn't wait until afterwards. If it's available to you, then you should actually take it. Take every advantage to just sort of take yourself out of that very scary cohort that can actually get COVID and be sick at the same time with kidney failure while you're waiting for an organ. And as always, the Kidney Foundation has got so many questions answered on their website. They really are an amazing organization for facts and for questions and for support too.
Great, perfect. Well, thank you. Does anyone else have anything they want to add in terms of what the community around transplant needs to be mindful of over the next few months as we head towards vaccines? Okay, well, maybe we'll take a couple minutes now with Dr. Kumar. We'd love to learn more about your vaccine study and what's it going to look at and what you're hoping to sort of learn and achieve through this study, and how patients can get involved. I'm going to sign up and check my antibodies.
Thanks, Joanne. So Yeah, so let me spend a minute or so talking about the research that we're doing. As I mentioned before, in the phase 3 vaccine studies that have been published, there really were no transplant recipients in that study. So we don't have that much information about transplant recipients, although more and more information is coming out from other countries. We are doing a study of looking at how well the immune system will produce antibodies in response to the COVID vaccine. So if you're interested in research and you're planning to get the COVID vaccine, it requires a little bit of blood, and we can check whether you have whether you develop antibodies after you get your vaccine. If you want to find out more, there's an email on the screen. It's preventcovid@uhn.ca. You're welcome to email us at that, and we can send you the information that's available. So I think research is important. It helps us to it actually helps us to improve care in the end. The more we know about how well vaccines work in people, the better we can deliver those vaccines and give you back the information that we learn.
Yes, that learning journey is so incredibly important. But I actually was getting blood work this morning at UHN, and I saw the sign, I guess, or box for this Prevent COVID study, and it's great to see it's already off the ground. And looking forward to learning more about the results as in the coming months. My takeaways from this conversation today is, we all have to follow the protocols. We all have to be very mindful of trying not to contract the virus and staying as healthy as possible, so that we can get the vaccine as soon as there's eligibility and as soon as it's available. So that couldn't have been clearer from all of you. So thank you very much. But I'll ask you, Dr. Kumar, is there any other final thoughts you'd like to leave our viewers with today before we re-meet again in March with a bit more information?
So I'll just say, to everybody that to get the vaccine is really an informed choice that you should make, and get yourself all the information you need. If you have any questions, ask your physician, your transplant physician, your transplant coordinator, ask us and satisfy yourself that you're making the right decision. As far as we at the transplant program are concerned, it's really a risk benefit. And I think we've mentioned this before, that the benefit of the vaccine, as we're seeing it right now with all the information that we have, the benefit of the vaccine outweighs any risk, and is better than actually getting the COVID infection. So I think there needs familiarize yourself with all the information that's out there, and we're here to answer your questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Kumar. And thank you to all the panelists for so generously giving some time today to walk us through all of these questions and help address the anxiety that some transplant patients and the community around us might have. To all of our viewers who have joined, you can find additional resources about COVID-19 and the vaccinations on the Canadian and American transplantation websites, which are listed here on the screen. As we mentioned, our next Q&A session will be held in March, on Monday, March 29th, and you can register at givelifeuhn.eventbrite.ca. And in the meantime, you can submit lots of questions on the slido.com app using the event code ATC-COVID, and you can upvote the questions you want to see, so they get prioritized and we address them. We had 200 to 300 this month, so let's aim for more next month. And another, an important reminder that as we continue to follow protocols, if you are going into any of the UHN hospitals for an appointment or hoping to visit someone, please review the UHN COVID policies beforehand. And there's currently a no visitor policy in effect. You can find updates at uhn.ca. And a little tip I learned today, that if you're a patient going in for an appointment, there's a website that lets you pre-screen in advance. You have a blue card, which will help make it more efficient. So I thought it was great. So I recommend using that. And finally, a big thank you again to Astellas Pharma for making these Q&A sessions possible, and for the ongoing support of the Toronto General and Western Hospital Foundations. Thanks again. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll hope to see you on the March 29th.